Right, so a decent game here by Brad, and the nature of the game is a little bit more positional. Usually, Brad is playing like attacking chess, they're trying to win the game, but in chess, we need to be masters of both styles. We need to be aggressive when it's needed, we need to be positional when it's needed. So, in this one, the game was very, very positional because of the opening, which was the Queen's Gambit declined, and here you chose the c6 move, which actually is a very solid structure. You build a chain of pawns on the light squares. And the other structures actually include maybe h6 first, put the bishop to h4, then b6, bishop b7, and put the light square bishop there immediately, and followed by c5. So in those structures, you don't actually put the pawn to c6 first. But this, when you put the pawn on c6 first, is a very, very solid way of playing as well. An opponent goes here bishop d3, and you correctly took the pawn on c4, making that bishop lose a tempo while its way to c4 and b5 immediately. Fantastic just so far. So first of all, the first 8 to 10 moves were fantastic. And here, the opponent actually grabbed the knight on f6 unprovoked. Usually we play h6 and the bishop drops back to h4. Sometimes it just ends up being on g3. Sometimes after h6, opponent likes to take the knight and eliminates it off the board because the nature of the position is closed. So bishop pair is not really a valuable asset in these kind of positions. However, the point here is that if your opponent had not taken the knight, and let's say he would have played a more natural move such as let's save the bishop first. So there are two ways to save the bishop first. So you can go bishop to b3 or bishop to d3. So we'll talk about the main move in this position. For example, bishop to d3, which is slightly more preferable than bishop to b3, as the bishop is biting on granite. So in this case, the main move for black, or main setup for black, is to continue with knight bd7. White would castle. You put the bishop to b7, completing the development. Let's say opponent plays rook c1, putting the rook on the semi-open c file. And now the move is a6, the move you played in the game. And the idea is that you want to support the b5 pawn because you're preparing the c5 break. And opponent here actually has a couple of moves. There is knight e4 and there is bishop takes knight. Bishop takes knight is a very nice move in this position, forcing the bishop to go to f6. And once this is done, then the knight can go to e4, attack the bishop. Bishop drops back to e7. And now, for example, opponent can go like a3, but the idea for black is to play a5, put the queen to b6, rook to c8, and engineer the c5 break. So yeah, that's the setup. And you want to go like a5 and support the b pawn with the queen, as the knight has moved away from c3. So the pressure is relieved from b5. But however, if opponent actually just does not take this knight, let's say they continue with something normally, like for example, a3 right away, then we play c5 and break open the position with the knight jumping in, and then we have solved all our opening problems. How is this different to bishop to b3 in this situation, when opponent chooses not to put the bishop on d3, but on b3 when it's biting on granite? So in this situation, you again just continue normally with bishop b7, white castles, knight bd7, and let's say rook c1. There is no need to go a6 now. I mean, a better move in this position would be, or let's say if we go a few moves ago, right after bishop to b3 is played, let's say we play bishop b7, castles, a5 is like the real move in this position, immediately going after the bishop. So for example, rook c1 is played, we go a4 and dropping the bishop back to c2, and now we play like queen to b6. Okay, here I see the queen to d3 is a massive threat, so maybe first we play knight bd7 to support our knight here. And now the queen d3 threat does not exist anymore, because bishop takes knight, the knight takes and then defends on h7. So for example, here opponent just goes like a3. Now we go queen b6 and engineer the c5 break this way. For example, knight e4, we play rook a to d8, and let's say queen e2 is played, and finally we play c5. Pawn takes and knight takes is just fantastic. We'll be getting a piece on the b3 square, for example, the knight, and this position is okay for black to play. Also, in this setup, when your bishop is For example, opponent actually immediately takes the knight on f6, you take back, and opponent puts the bishop on b3. Again, the idea would be to play a5. Because the bishop is on b3, we want to challenge it with a quick a5, a4 instead of the a6, which is also a good move. But the accurate way of dealing with bishop on b3 would be a5, a4. Just like we talked about that principle, when the knight is on b3, we want to attack it with a5, a4, or the knight is on g3, we want to attack it with h5, h4. Similarly, the bishop can be chased away from b3 square with quick a5, a4. And here a6 is a little bit slower, but it's a fine move to play. Again, you're going for the c5 break, but it can also be achieved with the a5 move order. For example, white castles, we go a4, bishop c2, we put the knight to d7. For example, queen d3 is played, we just go g6 and cut that attack. For example, rook c1, we just now go queen b6. Like we control the c5 square a lot of times, and for example, now here we just okay, maybe first put the bishop on b7 so that the rooks can get centralized pretty quickly. A3, and finally we play c5. And after takes, it's a good position for black, opening up everything. Now we even go bishop a6 with the threat of b4. So that's a little bit of difference between the bishop going to d3 and b3 in this kind of situations in the triangle defense, basically. If bishop goes to b3, strike with quick a5, a4. If bishop goes to d3, then play a6, c5 idea, but only after you develop your minor pieces to like bishop to b7 and knight d7, a6, c5. So that's what I wanted to highlight here. Yeah, the game continued pretty well for you here, and it was an equal position, but opponent here decides to castle long and go for some sharp play on the king side. And now the c file, there's no c pawn on the c file for white. If there was a pawn on c2, then it would have been very, very safe for white, and white would have probably been better. But because we have the potential to open up the c file for the attack on the queen side, we are just doing great here. So on move 21, when you actually decided to keep the position closed, then your own pawns became a shield for white king against your heavy pieces. So these heavy pieces are now very, very sad about the presence of these pawns in front of them. Imagine these three pawns did not exist. All of these three pieces would have like a clear vision on white king and would have been great. So that's why it was important to capture the pawn on d4. And let's say pawn takes back. First of all, the c file opens up, and now you have a great attacking chances on the c file. You just put rook c8, c7, and then other rook to c8, double up and put a lot of pressure on the c file. And also, if your opponent is able to neutralize that pressure, let's say, and everything gets traded off, guess who has greater number of pawn islands? 1, 2, 3, 4 pawn islands for white, and 1, 2, 3, sorry, just 1 and 2 pawn islands for black. Black would be having a significant amount of advantage in the end game because of these isolated pawns on these files for white. So if you had envisioned that, it would have been great. It would have been easy for you to take. And of course, queen cannot take back because the bishop is defending. So pawn takes, and we create more weaknesses in white's camp. Not just that, we also create attacking possibilities on the c file. So for that reason, it was super important to take the pawn. Once you push it, you keep the pawn structure for white healthier, just 3 pawn islands instead of 4. You still have 2 pawn islands, but at least white's pawn structure is much healthier than the other variation. And also, these pawns are going to shield white's king from the attack with these heavy pieces that you have on the queen side. And also, we don't want to be putting our pieces on the same diagonal, especially on the light squares, if our opponent has a light square bishop. What I would be doing is just maybe putting my pieces on the dark squares, just in case, because it's a light square bishop, I want it to feel dead in the game. So once I have put my pieces on the light squares, and that too on the same diagonal, obviously some deadly skewer is going to come, and this finally appeared, and the position collapsed after this. Once you blunder and exchange something like that, the morale actually collapses, and then you just are basically losing in next few moves. So up till some point, you played the game brilliantly, up till that move 21. If you had captured on d4, it would have been a very, very decent positional masterclass simply. But Okay, the important points I think we picked from the game and will be helpful for you to play better games in future, especially the positional games.